Hi. Third wave from groove synthesis takes inspiration from the classic PPG and runs with it, adding on top of it modern wavetable synthesis, FM, virtual analog oscillators, and digital and analog filter pairs. With plenty of hands-on controls and I/O. It's a 24-voice, 4-part multi-timbral synth, which supports splits, layers, and panning, along with multiple digital effects. It has a built-in library of dozens of classic PPG and modern third-wave wavetables, and lets you create your own either by sampling directly into the synth or importing wave files. It also doesn't skimp on modulation with 3 wave envelopes, 4 LFOs, and 4 regular envelopes, a sequencer and arpeggiator, along with an extensive mod matrix with over 100 destinations. In this video, I'll take an in-depth look of what it can do, as well as pros and cons compared to other synths in the category, and play you plenty of its sounds in the outro. Before I start, a quick disclosure: I got third wave directly from Groove Synthesis and it cost me substantially less than retail. Despite that, they have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, including quite a few multi-sampled sounds from this synth. Funding also comes from YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's start with an overview. Each of Third Wave's 24 voices has 3 oscillators that can be in one of 3 modes, either 8-bit PPG wavetable mode, high-resolution modern wavetables, and one of a few virtual analog shapes, including supersaw and noise. The oscillators also support FM and oscillator sync cross mods. These oscillators get fed into a digital state variable filter and then into an analog low-pass filter, so a pair of these per 3 oscillator voice. These voices then go into a digital effects section with 2 effects slots. Third Wave's 24 voices can be split evenly between up to 4 parts or timbres, so you get either 24 voices if you use just one timbre, then 12, 8, and 6 voices per part or per timbre if you use them all. In terms of modulation, there's also quite a bit going on. Each oscillator gets a dedicated 6-stage wave envelope to scan through the single cycle waveforms or frames in its wavetable. Then again, per voice, you've got 4 assignable LFOs and 4 assignable envelopes. The first 2 envelopes are linked by default to the filter and to the VCA, and the wave envelopes and the regular envelopes can be looped as well. You can assign these sources and multiple other sources either through the quick on-panel shortcuts or through the extensive mod matrix, which we'll take a look at later. In terms of build, Third Wave has quite a bit of heft. It's an all-metal panel and enclosure. Nothing about it feels cheap. The buttons require a committed and firm press. The screen isn't OLED, but is very crisp with very good viewing angles. The knobs are a mix of pots. These are the ones that have these lines on them, and endless encoders. These are the knobs without lines on them. The keybed is a 5-octave semi-weighted keyboard with channel aftertouch, meaning that if you play a chord, then pressure modulation will be identical for all the notes you play. Though you can work around this if you create a split like I did here, where only one side is affected by aftertouch. The mod and pitch bend wheels, I think they're plastic, but they respond quite nicely. In terms of connectivity, you've got 4 stereo outputs you can assign per timbre pair if you like. You've got a 1/4-inch headphone output for the mix, All the outputs, by the way, are unbalanced outputs, unfortunately, and indeed in this setup I had a ground loop which I bypassed using an isolator. Then you've got 4 inputs, audio in for sampling your own custom wavetables, and 3 additional inputs for expression pedals and CV. All of these also appear as sources in the mod matrix. Then further down, you've got MIDI in, out, and through, and then finally a USB Type-B device port, which can both send MIDI back and forth and be used to access the internal drive to transfer audio files for creating wavetables, for firmware updates, and to transfer patches and wavetables back and forth. You can't send audio over USB though, just through the analog outputs. In terms of presets, you've got 5 banks of factory presets with 100 presets per bank, with either 1 or more timbres per preset, depending on the one you choose. They're quite varied and useful, I think. Like I mentioned, I'll play you more of them later on. And then you've got 34 PPG wavetables. These are 8-bit sort of lo-fi wavetables. And then 64 user wavetable slots. These are nicely named and done. You've got 48 factory wavetables, and then you can load up to 16 of your own or replace the existing wavetables. And we'll get to these in a bit. Like I mentioned, you've also got a few virtual analog options. To complete the overview, while many of Third Wave's parameters are accessible on the panel, some are only available using the screen detent encoders. So for example, for the oscillators, you've got direct access and control over pitch, fine pitch, choosing the wavetable or waveform, the wavetable offset and level. And you can also control many of these parameters here as well using the detent encoders, but you've often got additional options here, for example, to show the waveform or to access additional parameters which you can't access on the panel. So for example, mapping the keyboard to modulate through the waveform, oscillator sync, and cross oscillator FM. Now there's no button to reach these screens, so you need to wiggle one of the parameters to access them. So say for example, for the envelopes, if I want to access the delay parameter, you can't do that on the panel. You touch one of these knobs and then you've got the delay parameter here as well as a few additional parameters. If you want to view these pages without changing the parameter, you hold compare and then wiggle the knob, and then the parameter won't change until you release the knob. And you can then go ahead and look at the additional parameters that aren't accessible on the panel. I wouldn't call this menu divey by any means. It's sort of like a little tab for the main parameters and another tab for additional parameters per module. So that's it in terms of an overview. Let's dive in a little bit deeper into each of the modules. I'll start with the oscillators. If you want to start up an init patch, just hit init program. This starts up with the oscillators all at 1/3 of the level. So I'll lower them down and we'll just listen to one at a time. It also has a wave envelope going on by default, so I'll turn that off as well. And by default, pan spread is also on, so I'll turn that down. So I mentioned this earlier, the oscillators have 3 modes PPG wavetables, which start with P, and then user waveforms that start with U, with quite a few factory waveforms, and finally the A's, which are virtual analog style shapes. If you're not familiar with wavetable synthesis, the idea is that each wavetable tells a timbral story with a set of single cycle waveforms, which you can move through using this mod wheel or using the wave offset knob. And I've got Waveflow on. If I don't, then moving through the offset will be clicky. So Waveflow smoothens that. And you also get a view into the waveforms here if you want. So 64 waveforms per table. The original PPG waveforms also had these additional single cycles at the end, these sort of virtual analog style shapes, in addition to the waveforms that changed from wavetable to wavetable. By default, you can't hear those here, which is a good thing because you don't want to unintentionally drastically change the timbre. However, if you want to enable these, just go to Waveflow and turn on use upper wavetable, in which case we will hear these. Here we go. And if you modulate past the last waveform, it'll move on to PPG wavetable number 30. Apparently that's how the original PPG behaved. Anyway, so ignoring these last waveforms, each wavetable tells a different timbral story. Let's turn on Waveflow and turn this off. And you could hear the aliasing here, or the artifacts in the PPG style waveforms. By the way, if you want, there's an option to smoothen out these artifacts. So without smoothing, let's leave it on. Now I won't go through all of these, but like I mentioned, each wavetable tells a different story. For example, this one sounds like oscillator sync. Luckily we have oscillator sync here, but in an age of digital synths that didn't have that, you've got that here. And say, for example, this one is PWM. We have that as well, but this is here for old time's sake. So if you want the classics, they're here. I think the new high-res wavetables are much more interesting. For example, this one has something to say. And like I mentioned, you can create your own and import them. So I'll just show off with this one. Here we go. And I'll turn on wave smoothing for this. Notice the Australian accent because I made this using the speech synthesis in VitalSynth on my computer. So aside from loading your own, there are some pretty nice ones in here, I think. For example, let's say this one's pretty wild. But also tamer ones. Yeah, back to a Buchla again, but I think these sound quite nice as well. So you can modulate your way through these wavetables, change wave offset manually per oscillator, or use the wave surfer knob to change the offset for all three oscillators at once. I think that this patch is literally asking for it. So those are the built-in and user wavetables. Let's move on to the virtual analog oscillators. The offset parameter isn't relevant here, so in this case it lets you change the waveform. In the case of the saw, and certainly for the square, modulate this and you have PWM, triangle, sine, not a big difference here, and super saw. Super saw takes a bit more CPU, so you can only use it on 2 oscillators at once, not 3. And then beyond these wave shapes, you've got 2 shades of noise, again with offset control, more through white, pink, and red, or white, blue, and violet. So that's it for the wave shapes. You've also got oscillator sync, like I mentioned earlier. So if I increase pulse width here back to 50, go to Misc, turn oscillator sync on or off. When we get oscillator sync, you've also got FM. So FM is a matter of the ratios between the oscillators. In this case, oscillator 2 is modulating oscillator 1, 3 modulates 2, and then 1 modulates 3 if you want. And that's how you get FM style sounds here as well. And if you choose crazier wave shapes, then all bets are off, of course. And you can increase the mod depth of the FM if you like, using any mod source. Let's see a few presets with FM bell-like sounds. This one's nice, and I think also this one does it nicely. One last thing about the oscillators, according to the manual, the sum of their levels can't pass 100 if you want to avoid distortion. I noticed that sometimes you get nice and pleasant harmonic distortion if the sum passes 100, and sometimes you do get a bit of crackling. Let's continue on down the signal chain. Audio is passed from the 3 oscillators into the digital 12 dB per octave state variable filter, then through a saturation circuit, which does add harmonic distortion as well, into an analog 24 dB per octave low pass filter. All this per voice, by the way, for each of the 24 voices. So I'll go for noise to show you what this does. So the state variable filter goes from low pass, morphs into a notch filter, and into a high pass filter. That's if this bandpass button is off. If it's on, then it morphs from low pass through bandpass to high pass. And it has resonance, doesn't self-oscillate. But gives a nice frequency boost, and that's what it does in notch mode. And you can tie the cutoff to velocity if you want, and obviously to the filter envelope. We'll get to that later. And you've got a few other miscellaneous parameters. Won't go through all of these. And then moving on to the low pass filter. So let's clean this up. I'll pick a sawtooth. For this filter, we saw the saturation circuit earlier. Adds a nice harmonic distortion. Cutoff 24 dB per octave. 4-pole with resonance. It does self-oscillate. Has nice grit. Notice a bit of lag here if I move the knob quickly. Obviously when you modulate it works fine. Let's give it a bit of kick with the envelope. By the way, if you want to compare the two filters, let's maybe get an ARP going. So this is what the analog filter sounds like in a slightly more musical context. And let's open up the cutoff, close resonance, and try and do the same thing here. This is the digital SVF, in low pass mode, of course. So not too shabby SVF either. By the way, one of my favorite things about the analog filter is that they've got a resonance compensation feature, which is on by default. So as you increase resonance, you don't get the bass pulled out from under you. So you go down an octave. No resonance. And without the compensation, it would have sounded like this. So you have the choice, which is great. Loss of bass is quite noticeable if you don't have this on, and not noticeable at all if it's on. If I have a dying synth wish, it's that every instrument with an analog 24 dB per octave filter would have this option on by default, please. Speaking of additional parameters, you can set the filter to track the keyboard, and if you set it to about 63 or 64, it'll track the keyboard more or less chromatically across an octave or two. And occasionally the filters will get out of tuning. You can calibrate them in the global settings. Moving on down the signal chain, next up is this pan spread control. Like I mentioned earlier, as you open this up, notes will alternate increasingly to the left and right. And from here we get to the effects. You've got 2 effects slots with 8 effects here, and those same 8 effects in the second slot with 4 additional ones. You turn it on, choose the effect type. So simple stereo delay and chorus. You can always control 2 parameters on the panel, and there are more on-screen parameters. You've got a mix control for the effects. Anyway, so nice chorus, phaser, flanger, distortion. So, nice going there. Wesley speaker. And ring mod. I think that's the last one here. Let's maybe turn this off. And then in the second slot, you've got a few reverbs, room, and concert hall, and super plate, which can go quite long. With tone control. And I think that's it in terms of parameters for that. And there's also a, where are you at? Echoplex style delay here. With wow and flutter controls. Let's maybe listen to the reverb in the context of a patch. So, very nice sounding effects, I think. There are some limits on the effects, by the way, if you plan to use more than 2 parts. So each part can have its own 2 effects, but the reverbs and I think the Leslie and tape delay can only be used once per pair of part 1 and 3 and 2 and 4. There's more in the manual if you want exact details. If you do use combos you're not allowed to, you'll hear some crackling. I think they should just prevent you from doing that at all, or give you a screen message if you're using an effect too many times in parts 3 and 4. Okay, so that's the signal path. Let's talk about modulation, and I'll start with the wave envelopes. These are 6-stage envelopes that are mapped by default to the offset of each of the 3 oscillators. So you turn them on, and then you choose the one that you want to edit. You can edit more than one at once. And like I mentioned, these are 6-stage envelopes where you've got time and position, time and position for the first 3 stages, and then stages 4 through 6, and they will simply scan through the wavetable, traveling along this envelope. A couple of things I wish they would add here. I wish they'd add some sort of animation to show you where you're at across this envelope, and I wish they'd show you time in absolute values as opposed to just these, oh, here we go. As opposed to just these numbers, 0 through 127. It would be nice to just see values in seconds or milliseconds. You can either edit the wave envelope here, by the way, or just by using these arrows and position and time knobs. And if we get back to values, you can set this envelope to loop. You set the first start point, say 2, and release point, Then the envelope will loop between these 2 points. So those are the wave envelopes. Let's move on to the LFOs. Like I mentioned, you've got 4 of them. They're identical. Let's go through the destinations and point LFO1 to the low-pass filter. You can see there's a lot to choose from. Pick a destination. You pick a mount. And that's how LFOs work. Let's maybe go to reverse saw. Increase the rate. And that's pretty much all there is to it. You've got a few other shapes, square, different pulse rates, sine, and sample and hold or random. And you've also got a delay. No fade in here. And again, it would be nice if you'd see the time instead of just a number, but you've got a delay. You can sync it to the internal clock, and you can either have it reset when you press a note, or just go with whatever the LFO per voice is at. So that may or may not be in sync, depending on the phase of the LFO for that particular voice. It would be nice if they had a third option here to set these to just global mode, where they apply to all the voices with one single phase, one single LFO, so that you can get it to be consistent if you want all the voices to be in sync, but not necessarily press them all at the same time. So those are the LFOs, and we saw the envelopes earlier. Simple ADSR envelopes as far as panel controls go. There are no panel mapping options for these two because they're mapped directly to the filters or to the VCA. We already saw that earlier. And these are ADSR with, if you like, additional options for a delay, 2 shape modes, exponential, and a PPG mode, which is totally different. More linear shape, and they can loop as well, so they can be LFOs. Loop nicely into audio rates. So that's the filter envelope. The amp envelope has a few additional options for velocity response, and then envelopes 3 and 4 aren't mapped to anything by default, but they have these quick mapping knobs so that you can choose a destination, dozens of destinations here, and amount, and quickly get that going. And they can loop as well, and I think that's it for the envelopes. At some point, you'll want more than just what the panel mappings can offer, more sources and destinations, and that's what the mod matrix is for. The mod matrix has 16 empty slots that are assignable to whatever you like, and then a few fixed slots for the LFOs. That's what you change with these knobs. For the envelopes, that's what you edit with these knobs. The wave envelopes can also be assigned to multiple destinations, not just the wave offset. And then you've got a few pre-assigned slots for the mod wheel, velocity, and pressure. So sources are fixed here, destinations aren't, and everything's up for grabs with the first 16 mod slots. You can assign sources and destinations by using the screen encoders, but there's no need to work hard. If you hit a source and just touch any on-panel control, you can change the source like this. And even I think, yeah, keyboard velocity and pressure if you like, mod wheel, pitch wheel. And same goes for destinations. So if I wanted to, say, assign the pitch wheel to, I don't know, effect parameter 1 and set a mod depth, of course, turn this on, and let's maybe choose the, Echoplex. Why not? So now this can both bend pitch and the time of the delay if we want. So the mod matrix is fun, easy to use, and useful. One thing that would have been nice to see here would be a control for each slot. So say, for example, if I wanted to have the mod wheel control the mod depth of one of the assignments here, one of the slots. You could still do that for many of the parameters. So for example, LFO amounts or envelope amounts. Here we go. I think it would be nice if they added mod slots here as an option as well. There are a few other destinations here that are interesting that aren't on the panel. For example, drift. Here we go. Oscillator drift. Let's maybe assign the mod wheel to this so we don't go too crazy. Do this if you want to feel like your synth needs to see a technician urgently. And in terms of sources, some interesting off-panel sources are, I think random is a good one. There's no number, but random is a fun one, which will randomize a parameter every key press. So if, say, we point this to a more interesting destination, I'll go for filter cutoff. But now every key press, we'll get a different filter frequency. Okay, let's zoom out and look at the multi-timbrality of third wave. So timbres can either be split or layered. So in this case, for example, this is one timbre and the second and the third, and together they're this. So if you hit any one of these or just hit the mode button, you can see we've got quite a few controls for these timbres. You've got levels and panning for each of the parts, and tuning as well. Here we go, tuning. So for a really nice effect, you can create one nice timbre and then copy it and then pan those timbres and maybe make slight changes to get a binaural style patch, and then splits. So we've got everything layered here, but we could easily add additional layers. Let's maybe remove this and set different split notes. Say put a split here, and then put this split here. Okay, so now we've got this timbre here, this timbre here, and this timbre here. Okay, let's move on and look at the arpeggiator and sequencer. I'll start with the arpeggiator. It's got a few modes. Usual suspects, Stranger Things mode, order, and pretty much that. Octave range. Tempo controls, then relative speed, and then it's got a few hold modes, a few latch modes. So normal will add notes and not remove them. I think it would be nice if they'd let you remove notes, but that's the way that it is now. And then chord mode works as you'd expect. Just swapping out the chord as you play it. And I think that's all there is to know about the arpeggiator. And then you've got a sequencer. By the way, the tempo knobs do the same thing, control the same tempo. Anyway, if we go into the sequencer and clear any patterns I have here. So there's no step sequencer here. You can only play live into a sequence. You set the number of measures up to 32 measures. Let's go for, say, 4 here. If you hit record and play, you'll get a 1-bar count in, and then it'll just start recording as you play live. I'm going to lower the tempo. And then maybe just play something into here. And this is quantized by default, so you can hear my bad playing unquantized if you like, or over quantized with swing. Cool. We could overdub this if we wanted. And also record parameter automation. So we turn that on. and hit record when we're ready. You need to make sure to stop recording, otherwise if there's overlap, you'll hear some jitter between the values as they cross over. So that's basic sequencing. If you have multiple parts with different sounds or different splits, you can sequence them separately. They just have to be the same number of measures for all the parts in a pattern. You can mute a part if you like, which works if you have more than one part recorded. You can clear a part, copy it. You can also clear automation only, if you like, or clear the entire pattern. And then finally, there's even a song mode here, so you can record in quite a few patterns. Let's say this one is 4 measures, and another one would be, whatever, 2. Anyway, go into song mode, and then decide the order of the patterns, and you can also have a different play count for the different patterns. And this will play through your song. Let's move on and talk about making your own wavetables. You can either sample audio through the input in the back or load up files from your computer into WaveMaker. Read WaveMaker file. This is the file I've got here. This is the file that I created using Vital.
Hello, Lopop.
And this is what it sounds like, the sample itself. It's best if you pitch it to 93.75 Hertz, which is basically F sharp in octave 1. And then you can trim the sample if you like, the start and end.
Lopop. Hello, Lopop.
Trim the end off.
Hello, Lopop. Hello, Lopop.
Which is always good to let it analyze exactly what you need. And there are a few parameters that are documented in the manual, which I'm going to ignore. Just hit make table and then save. I can rename this if I want, but let's just leave it at this. Hit OK. And then if I just go ahead and do an init program and then go ahead and look for my user wavetable number 56, and I'll turn this off and just scroll through the wavetable using this wheel. We've got our wavetable, and we can, of course, where are we at? Look at it here. And the beauty of this, I think, is not just to say hello, Lopop, but rather to create a patch that uses parts of the wavetable and creates your own sound, which is sort of reminiscent of the original sound. Before we head out to the pros and cons, let's take a look at a few miscellaneous features. The Unison mode can get pretty massive. So one voice. This is one oscillator, by the way. 24 voices. With a single oscillator. Let's add more oscillators. So that's 72 oscillator Unison, if I did the math right. So that's Unison, and you can also use the Unison button to program chords. Let's look at global settings. I'll just scroll through these and you can pause the video if you'd like to see what they are. A lot of controls in here per part. You can import programs, export them, export wavetables and import them. Bypass the analog filter if you want. And then miscellaneous features. These I think are per program. Change the output routing. Remember, there are 4 pairs of outputs on the back. And there's a master compressor. A few other modes. And you can route the audio input to the filters if you want. Okay, let's take a look at some pros and cons for third wave. At its price, it certainly isn't an impulse buy. However, when you consider its 24 analog and hybrid voices, its size, quality of build, the keyboard, number of controls, and high-resolution screen, it's not priced outside the range of its peers. Probably the closest synth in terms of the intent of its creators is the Waldorf M. It's about half the price, but desktop only only 8 voices, has fewer controls, and doesn't include effects or additional features that this has. That said, it is less expensive and has similar tones. Then there's Waldorf's Iridium keyboard, similarly priced or less expensive depending on where you look, with only 16 voices and no analog filters if that's important to you, but with substantially more synthesis engines including samples, granular physical modeling, and multi-operator FM. Iridium's keyboard is only 4 octaves, but it does have polyphonic aftertouch compared to channel aftertouch here. There are obviously many other differences and details to consider when comparing these two to Third Wave. I invite you to watch my reviews of them if you want to dig deeper, and there are obviously smaller and less expensive but still interesting wavetable synths like Peak, Hydrasynth, and ModWave. Let's set those aside and look at Third Wave's merits on its own on the pros side, and you can judge for yourself from the sound demos coming up later in this video. In my opinion, Third Wave sounds very, very good and has its own distinct character. Sometimes wavetable synths can sound thin. Not this one, in my opinion. Again, stick around, you'll hear gritty basses, distorted leads, lush pads, and truly wild, evolving soundscapes. And while it does crazy wavetables nicely, it also handles FM and subtractive synthesis without breaking a sweat, and the fact that it's 4-part multi-timbral means that you can get even more creative with layers and splits. It comes with 500 presets. Many of them are excellent, interesting, varied, and usable, and alongside them, the factory wavetables it comes with are also diverse and interesting to explore, and if you ever get tired of them, it's pretty simple to load up your own. Then further on the pros, the hands-on controls are indeed a joy to use. Yes, some parameters are only accessible in a menu, and some share controls like the LFOs and the 2 envelopes, but overall, this synth is as close as you can get to knob per function with this amount of features. So those are the pros. Let's take a look at some of the cons. On the hardware side, while the build is great, I was disappointed that the outputs are unbalanced. I got ground loop noise in my setup, which I fixed with an inexpensive oscillator, but balanced outputs would have been ideal. Then on the synth side, it doesn't have some of the wave shaping amenities like various spectral morphs and folding options you'll see on some hardware and software wavetable synths. You can, of course, recreate these manually externally and import them as wavetables, but that's a workaround. Then there are a few issues that might be addressed in firmware updates. First, there were a few bugs I discovered which were promptly fixed during the review process, but it's early days and there may be more which I didn't find. Hopefully they'll address those as well if they crop up. Then beyond that, you have to watch levels on the oscillators, otherwise you might get distortion and a kind of crackling, which isn't a nice saturation like on the analog filter or like the cases where I showed you where it did sound nice, where we kind of cranked these up. Then a few other minor feature requests. It would be nice if hold were per part as opposed to being global so that you can get an ARP going on 1 or 2 multi-parts and then play the others on top of that. One thing I really wish they'd add is a graphic visualization of the knob positions as opposed to just showing numbers. So for example, levels go up to 170, filter cutoff goes up to 127 here, but say on the effects goes to 255 and reverb time goes up to 255 as well. It would be nice if there would be like a little knob drawn here so that you'd know where you are within the parameter range. It's especially useful if you're using the endless encoder controls. You can obviously see where a parameter is by looking at the little line on the pots. Speaking of that, it would also be nice if they'd show times on the ADSR and wave envelope times as opposed to just numbers, because these can vary wildly from very short to quite long. It would be nice if they just said how many milliseconds or seconds these values are. I mentioned this earlier, it would also be good to have an animation here on the wave envelope so we'd know where we are as it plays. So that's it for Third Wave. I'll put up multi-samples of over 15 of my favorite presets and sounds I created on my Patreon so you can get a taste of playing Third Wave on your computer or hardware synth that supports multi-samples. Stay tuned for quite a few patch demos, and if you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.